Circle podcast features experts in all the nuanced areas of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum with the aim of helping women make the choices that will keep them safe, healthy, and empowered. We respect all birth choices and believe in supporting informed consent and evidence-based practices. Nothing said on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. You should always seek the advice of a competent professional for your care. Welcome to the Birth Circle podcast.
Sarah with Birth Circle, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Marinah Farrell, and she is the executive director of the Changing Women Initiative. It's a Native American-centered health and justice organization serving New Mexico and Arizona. But as we talked about before we started recording, this is applicable all over the world. So we're so excited to hear about her expertise. She's active in multiple public health initiatives and coalitions with her community and at the national and international levels. She's got backgrounds in, very diverse background in street level medic work and immigration activism in Arizona, clinical government policy work in Mexico and Africa, organizational development and facilitation in the U.S., Mexico with various nonprofits, and a founding board member of a free primary care clinic called the Phoenix Allies for Community Health. She's also passionate about advocating for traditional and community health workers and has worked as a staff midwife for birth centers and medical facilities internationally. She's also been a program coordinator for traditional midwives and an educator. She's the owner of Phoenix Midwife, which is a long-standing midwifery practice, and Casa Ancestral, focused on creating traditional healing spaces. Marinah has worked extensively in North America in the North American midwifery collaborations and served as a past president of MANA, Midwives Alliance of North America. That was a mouthful because you are all the things. So thank you.
Definitely. Sorry about that.
Oh, darn. Your resume's too long. Okay, that's why I'm the host and not the actual podcaster, because my tongue gets all twisted. That was amazing. I'm so excited to hear about everything you have to say. So first of all, what does the Changing Women Initiative do?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for asking me to come on the show. It's really nice to be here. So I'm Marina or Marina, if you speak Spanish. I am really excited to talk a little bit about our work here at Changing Women Initiative. Changing Woman is actually a deity, a Dene or Navajo deity, and she represents sort of the life force and the life change of a woman's, just her life cycle, basically. And so there's lots of stories around Changing Woman. And so our founder, Nicole Gonzalez, is Dene, and she decided that, for her, Changing Women really exemplified what women go through their entire life cycle. And, we always like to be gender neutral at Changing Women. So we think women and people who identify with the deity and with the changes in their life and things like that. The big journey, I guess. It's such a
Oh,
big
okay. So
journey.
it's a deity, but it's a deity that
Mhm.
centers on the changes and the growth in life, or tell us more
Oh
about that.
yeah. So there's a lot of stories around her. And so that would be like a whole podcast in and of itself.
Oh,
I
okay.
would recommend though, on our website, Nicole's sister, Kansas Begay, who was a Miss Indian World, she actually tells the story of Changing Women. It's a beautiful story. So I would recommend to anybody, if you have an interest and you want to hear the story, just head over to our website and you can hear her tell the whole story. But it's really cool because I think for Nicole, it motivated her to sort of think about how the journey of birth really changes people and what it can do in terms of healing and in terms of how people think about their lives, and not just how they're birthing, but how they're eating and how they're parenting and how they're healing from their own traumas. Like there's so many pieces, and how their community views birth. So Changing Women really seeks to address this idea that the way that we birth is how we heal our communities. And so
Mm.
Changing Women does it with a focus on tribal communities in New Mexico. But for sure, we are in touch with, and I feel like we work with, and we also maybe have an impact on, because I know they have an impact on us, other Native projects throughout North America.
Awesome. So so you're based in this deity, but your modality for healing is kind of birth. That's the what you've kind of picked to focus on as a tool for healing.
For sure. It's kind of like the bringing back of the midwife. So, midwives in traditional communities, we were the original primary care providers.
Yeah,
And
it's so true.
so, yeah, so it's bringing back the midwife. And by bringing back the midwife, you bring back aspects of traditional healing and medicine that are so important. And so yes, it's about birth, but it's also just about how we are, how we're born, how we take care of each other, how we support one another, how we heal through foods or through traditional medicines, how we educate one another. So I think when you think about the work of the midwife in her community, it's really so much broader than just birth. So for us, it's bringing back traditional midwives. So in our case, it's tribal midwives back to their communities because basically tribal midwives were decimated by
Yeah.
colonialism, So it's a way to bring back the healing to every individual community because every tribal community is different.
Yeah.
And so by bringing back their midwives, they'll bring back a lot of traditional healing and health.
It's the first step, one of the first step, and probably the most powerful step, right, in reclaiming that
Yeah.
heritage. Okay, so let me backtrack a little bit. What got you into this whole birthy world?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So, I always feel like I was chosen. I was chosen divinely to be a midwife. But that being said, oftentimes midwives don't know that. And so in my case, I have been active in movement work since I can remember. I remember being in the third grade and forming my first coalition.
Oh
And
my
actually,
gosh.
like, I
I love
created
it.
symbols for us and I held signs. And I remember talking about Jimmy Carter. I mean, the whole thing, like in the third grade.
Wow.
And so I was also only one of a couple of people of color at my school. And so that also had a significant impact on me as well. So, really my whole life, I've been in some form or another involved in coalition or collaborative work
I
around
love that
equity
you
and
that you knew
justice.
that I'm like, what was I doing in third grade? I was selling like 80s version fidget
Aw.
spinners out of my desk. I was like the wheeling and dealing, trying to get like the business, like getting our coupons
That's
together to
pretty
buy a
cool.
popsicle party. I love it. Yeah. What were you doing in
That's
third
very
grade? And what does it?
enterprising.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people like one of the first symbols that I was like, oh, this is going to be our logo. I mean, I even knew the word about a logo in the third grade,
Yeah.
and it was actually the anarchist symbol, which I had no idea ever. I don't even know where I saw that, but so I kind of was born into this body and into this
That's so
journey
funny.
with yeah, just with
I love
some
it.
knowing.
I love it so that you've been prepared for this work your whole life and just even before. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, I think that that's how midwives are chosen. I think we come in to do a certain job, and and I think that I actually pursued politics. So I studied political theory and politics. I thought I was going to go into academia, and instead ended up getting more and more involved in the work of advocacy for midwives and became a midwife. So that's sort of how it started. But I grew up with a healer. My mother was a healer, so I grew up really truly learning from my first teacher about herbal medicines and traditional healing and also home birth. And so I think that it's just always been my path. And I think I've been a midwife for over 25 years and I've worked in every setting. I've had a home birth practice in Arizona for a very long time. And so I think the combination of politics and clinical work in my life has brought me to where I am now with Changing Woman Initiative, which is a combination of both. It's a little bit about how we care in a very practical sense, very clinical sense for our families, but it's also about how we're going to change the world. So it's
Yeah.
both
Oh
things.
my goodness. I love it. I love it. Okay. So what types of midwives are there, especially in Arizona, but
Yeah.
midwives in the United States? And why is that so confusing? And why does that mess with you
Yes.
talked about how the midwife was taken away from colonialism, but now there's even more layers of confusion. So help us kind of cut through all that.
Yeah, I love that question, Sarah, because I do think it's very confusing especially in the United States. In what I always say is in the rest of the world, a midwife is a midwife. But here in the United States, it's very much not like that, because in the history of midwifery in North America, and I like to talk about North America as a whole, because for Indigenous peoples, our history is one. So it's really important that we don't believe in borders, that we don't believe in boundaries, because it further separates the work that we do as traditional peoples. So in the Americas, what ended up happening was that when obstetrics was sort of, came across the ocean and it landed in the United States, there were, of course, midwives practicing, many, many midwives.
Well,
And,
yeah, we've been
even
birthing,
depending on,
obviously.
yeah, right. I mean, for sure. And so by the 30s, though, male obstetrics had already started to sort of malign the midwife. And really what the thing is that midwives that were traditional midwives, whether they were Black midwives serving their communities in the South, or, other immigrant midwives or Indigenous midwives, what ended up happening was that they got more and more maligned, and
Hmm.
more sort of cast aside in a way that
Almost demonized a little bit.
we've never recovered from that.
No, we haven't.
And what the obstetric system did was actually subsume midwifery into nursing in the United States. So it was a way to sort of like have midwives under the control of a physician, but it was also a way to ensure that people that didn't have access to education and resources just could never get into the field. So it was a very colonial vision for how births
Hmm.
should happen, and it was taken out of communities and it was put into an institution. So really what ended up happening in the US is it wasn't really until the 70s or 80s when white feminism decided to bring it back. But for traditional communities, the impact it had on us was really devastating. Thankfully, in the Black communities, those midwives were really able to retain a lot of their traditions, but in Indigenous communities, there was almost none.
Hmm.
So it's a matter of bringing it back. Canada was lucky; they've had Indigenous and First Nations midwives practicing always, and they've been more respected. They've had birth centers and other areas like that for forever, and even now with their licensure, it's a much better system of licensure. And they are not nurses; they're midwives, and so they have a much broader scope of
Oh, yeah,
practice.
because in the United States, they have to go through nursing school to become a certified nurse midwife, or it's a direct
Yeah,
entry. And
right.
Mana, so yeah, to talk about, because I'm like, all the things because you were
I know all the
president of
things.
Mana. So yeah, the Midwives Alliance of North America. I know some of my
Mm.
friends have taken the big gnarly test. Um,
Yeah, that's actually something else. That's actually NARM, which
that's
is
NARM.
which is
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So
No.
explain. Okay. Fix it in my
Yes.
head.
That's okay. So Canada, right? They have a total formal way to get licensed. There's only one type of midwife there. And in Mexico, there is no licensure, but there
Hmm.
are thousands and thousands of practicing traditional midwives. So it's a very unique country. So what happened in the US is that, yes, so there's nurse midwives and there's CNMs, and it's a nursing degree that's a sort of a more specialized education. It's more like a master's or a PhD in nursing, so it has a specialized emphasis on midwifery. You also still do have traditional midwives in the US, and so they identify without having any sort of licensure through their regulatory system. And they vary. So, for instance, the Mennonite community, they may have their own midwives, and those are considered traditional midwives. They have no need to license because their work is very much based in community, and their community recognizes them and takes care of them as their
Mm-hmm.
traditional midwife. There are direct entry midwives, and it's a term that isn't really popular anymore because it was another way to sort of be derogatory about midwives. They would call us direct entry or lay midwives. And basically, it was kind of like saying, like, oh, they just kind of got here and were midwives without having gone through school, and they learned on
Mm,
YouTube and all this other stuff. But
no.
the reality is that really there's licensed midwives or there's certified professional midwives. And it's confusing because licensed midwives and certified professional midwives are not nurses. So consumers need to know that. Some consumers prefer nurses. But also, the way that the US regulatory system works is that every state has its own system of regulation.
Right,
So
exactly.
although I'm licensed in Arizona and in New Mexico, I could not get licensed in like Oklahoma, for instance, or Hawaii, or places like that, without either going through their system, or it's possible that they don't even have licensure.
Yep.
So it's a little bit
You
confusing in
could
that
come to
way.
Utah pretty much no problem. Yeah. I know
Yeah, yeah,
I'm kind of
Utah's doing
spoiled.
some exciting things.
Yeah, oh, Utah is neat. Very, very cool in terms of the laws that protect and
Yeah.
encourage safe midwifery practice. Love it.
Mhm.
So what does it mean so okay. Oh man, I have so many questions. So I want to get into the reclaiming birth and the cultural practices and how to heal through this space. But let me just ask one more question. It's kind of a segue. How do you then select the right provider for you dependent on your goals? Like
Mm.
if your goal is to reclaim to bring in spiritual or cultural practices from your heritage, or if you, I mean, how do you reconcile
Yeah.
which professional do you find?
Um, okay, so I'll preface this by saying it's probably 93% of midwives are white. They're not people of color. So, and then already there are not enough midwives in our country. So
Right.
that right there means that many, many people from people of color communities are not going to be served by anybody that's from their community. So I just really want to put that out there because I think that it's very hard to be someone that really wants to have ceremony and want to understand how your ancestors celebrated birth and what medicines they used and things like that. So sometimes there really isn't an option to have somebody that is a provider that can fully understand the nuances of one's own community. But what I would say is that for folks that are interested and they want a provider that's from their community or from their ancestry, social media is a really good place to
Yes,
start
it
because
is.
there's so
And
many
actually,
groups.
you brought up a point that I don't think I've ever, I mean, I thought about it, but not in these specific terms, like exactly.
Yeah.
But there are some people that don't even realize that they are part of a community. And it's not until that they have somebody that's kind of abrasive. Well, they'll see them as abrasive when it's just a cross-cultural incompatibility, right? So like so many of us assume
Mm,
that the people that we live around are kind of how everybody else thinks. My parents live in the South, and they tell me stories sometimes that come up in church. We're in the same basic church, but the denominations, the things that come up in the South are different than that come up here in Utah. And it's fascinating. So even not knowing that, I don't know, can you speak to that a little bit? Like
that's
income,
tricky because
yeah.
I think that I don't want to excuse the realities that we know that racism and bias in birth
Oh,
is
for
why
sure.
people of color are dying and why they don't have access to
Uh,
maternal health care and all these things. So I think that there is truth around cultural safety. So I think that there are practitioners that are more culturally safe than others. And so I think that a practitioner doesn't necessarily have to be from your community to be safe, but
yeah,
they
oh, I
may
love
not
that.
actually ever be able to understand fully the ceremony. So
Mhm.
this is particularly true for tribal folks. Native Americans, every government and every tribe is different and they all have their own ways, their own life ways, their own ceremonies, things like this. And it's so critical that it can't be overstated how important ceremony is to the work of birth and death both. And I think that
Mm.
also how often tribal members have to leave their communities to access care is also another problem. So I think so hard to answer that without really making the system and the racism in the system responsible for the fact that we can't access our care providers.
I'm
Our
okay if you hold it responsible, but I
yeah.
feel like some what you said triggered this thought in my mind that sometimes the abuse that we feel or that we experience when we go out of our culture it's because of a cultural incompatibility. And there is, like you said, there's safety in being with a culturally competent or somebody from your own culture. That's what you're seeing, right?
I'm saying that racism is usually to blame for the mistreatment of people in the
Mm,
maternal health system. It's not cultural incompatibility. It's generally
just
because
flat out
most
racism.
providers, yes, most providers are not people of color, and they have bias, and often people that are, oh, sorry, I have a little thing flying
There's
around
a
me.
bug.
Often people that are not, that do not have anti-racism training, or were not raised around people of color, or so many other things. It's bias that they may not even be aware of, but it's bias based in racism, because our
Ugh,
healthcare system is also based on that.
it
So
is. That's true.
incompatibility is a little bit different, and I think that we do see that sometimes here. We have, for instance, we have lots of different types of tribes here. And so as we look at who our providers are, we may have a provider that's from one community or one tribal community serving somebody that's in another, because there's less than 20 certified nurse midwives who are native in this
Oh my gosh,
country.
20.
Less than that. And there's probably less than like 10 certified professional midwives that are tribally affiliated. So there's so few that you're going to see them serving each other's community. And I
Yeah.
think in that case, it may not be racism. It could be people of color have bias also sometimes, but it could be more of a cultural incompatible thing, where it could be that maybe a Navajo midwife may not know the tribal
Yeah,
custom.
that's that. Okay, so I was being very generous in using the incompatibility, and that's a perfect example of some compatibility friction, but that's different than flat out racism.
Yeah, we know that our maternal numbers, like our stats in the US, we know that that's from racism. Like, it's without a doubt.
Yeah.
And so that's why I can't agree with it, because I think that it really is, for almost most of the time. It really is because of
So
racism, and
is MANA
because
does MANA incorporate encompass even certified nurse midwives, or is it only
mm,
professional midwives outside of the system? Is it only home birth and birth
well,
center
let me
midwives?
talk about the associations, because I think that's a good thing to talk about. So there are like five or six, I think, midwifery associations in the United States. That's another reason it's a bit confusing, because there's a bunch of them.
Right.
So there's the American College of Nurse Midwives, that they are for nurse midwives. And then there's an association that's specific to certified professional midwives. It's the NACPM, and they're specific to certified professional midwives. MANA is the Midwives Alliance of North America, and they're open to anybody. So any midwives, traditional,
Oh,
licensed,
got it.
certified
Okay, so
nurse.
it's probably the most inclusive,
Yeah,
the biggest.
yeah,
All
it's
right,
like all
got
of them.
it.
And then there's NAB, which is, gosh, I don't
North
want to
American
I don't
something.
want to. They're actually they are for Black birth. They're the
Oh,
National Association for Black Birth. And I'm so sad that I'm not remembering their whole full name right now. They used to have a different name, which is why
okay.
I
See, here's the
like
example. Let's
forget.
just pause really quick so you can find it, and then we'll
Yes,
just
let
pick
me
it up.
pause. This is great. Okay, perfect. So there's also the National Association to Advance Black Birth, and they're really powerful in terms of trying to organize an association to represent, Black midwives and things like that. And then there's all sorts of alliances. There's a lot of different alliances that
Yeah.
exist for birth workers and birth workers
Okay.
of color.
So, do you feel like racism is less or more of a problem? Like, do you think racism is less of a problem in um the lame? I agree with you. I don't like
No.
to call it direct entry. It's even worse.
It's not less of a problem, because in every association, except for the ones that are
Oh.
specifically for people of color, there's still almost entirely white midwives. And so they are not, as a matter of fact, I don't affiliate too much with any of those ones, except for the midwives, because we have seen through the last decade that all of the associations that are national associations have issues with racism.
Mm.
And so many of us have actually left the work. I worked with Mana for a long time. I left because they were very, very much being, just anti people of color, as I felt like the other associations were too. And I think a lot of us have kind of said like, hey, we're happy to work with you all and all of that. But truly, midwifery in this country belongs to people of color. I mean, that's just what's real. And so it's sad because our traditions were taken away from us, whether you're a Black person or a brown person or an Asian person. Our traditions were taken away from us and sort of repackaged into this different thing that absolutely became inaccessible to people of color. So families weren't able to become midwives, they weren't able to
Yeah,
access
that when you
midwives,
said that, that made my
on and
blood boil.
on.
That I had not thought of it that way, but it's so true. If you make it
Yeah.
inaccessible, then you inadvertently, I mean, you discourage brand new traditional midwives, to come
Yes,
up
for
because
sure.
they've
And then
already been disadvantaged.
yeah. And unfortunately, you see this in a lot of, I mean, this is not unique to North America. It's all over the place. There's vulnerable people all over the place. And so I do think that when you think about traditional midwives in the world, that our traditional midwives they're caught between traditional ceremonial practices and governments that don't honor those practices, as well as regulatory agencies that have their own motives for doing healthcare the way that they want to do healthcare. So
So how do we fix this?
really not unique.
Is it
Well,
trainings? Is it
I think it's empowering midwives. The World Health Organization is doing a lot of empowering of midwives and trying to have the world understand that midwives are the solution. We still have, what is that? I think 2 airplanes full of women that die every day. I mean, it's like crazy amount of maternal death that's still happening. And the World Health Organization has been really busy trying to sort of illuminate, like, gosh, if you all just get your midwives, get your midwives and support them, educate them, make them more available, especially like in rural areas or areas where there are gaps or areas where people are not able to access medical care for whatever reason. The thing is that the governments and the systems have to support those midwives because, for instance, I worked in beautiful community in southern Mexico, right on the border of Mexico and Guatemala. And I would go kind of back and forth. And I worked in the highest, it's a region in Mexico where it's the highest maternal mortality rate. And what I know and what everybody knows who does midwifery around the world is that midwives, particularly traditional midwives that maybe don't have like a formal education, but they've been working in their community, they
yes.
actually save lives every day.
Mm-hmm.
But the government blames them for poor outcomes. But what it really is that the government is not providing medicines or transportation or
Yeah.
equipment or
So
anything
for the
like that.
99 mamas they save, like I heard yeah, okay. Yeah, I've heard all the stories.
Right.
The one that
Yeah.
dies, they blame them. Whereas
Yes.
what's the mortality rate in the hospital under the medical care? Like I
Huge. And you'll never know because in a lot of those
no,
governments, it's very secret.
they'll mask
Well,
it with something
ours
else.
is exactly the same. The United States is exactly the same. Hospitals don't have to give out their stats. We know that we have we have the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation in the world. And hospitals can be very secretive about it, but you have one home birth gone awry
And the
and
whole
it's
state's a
the
flutter.
whole state, will find out or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this myth that I think one of the blessings of COVID is that I think that people who didn't feel that hospitals were dangerous before actually started to
I
understand
know.
that maybe they're not
Yeah.
the safest place. And it's something that people of color have known for forever.
Yeah.
We've known that hospitals are not really safe spaces for us. But I think for folks that are privileged and maybe had a little bit more of trust in that system, started to think like, hey, maybe I shouldn't. I'm having this beautiful, healthy, natural, wonderful pregnancy, and I have no existing health conditions. I have a great partner. I have a wonderful support system. I have good food and water and all this other good stuff. Like maybe I can actually have my baby at home. Maybe I'm not sick. Maybe I don't need to go to some
Mm-hmm.
place where there are sick people, especially sick people with COVID. So I think that there was a little bit of blessing in that when
Yeah,
people
I see
understood.
that
Yeah.
too. One of the scary thing. So some people went to home births that weren't really ready for home birth. So that, I mean, there were
Yes.
some pluses and minuses, but overall, I feel like COVID
Very
actually really
true.
helps the birth world. I think it kind of, I mean,
Yeah, I do think I know that midwives
overall,
were
long term, I think it's a benefit, but short term, there's a lot of PTSD happening right now.
yeah, I think that a lot of midwives did have to sort of reckon with like, hey, some of these people coming are coming because they're afraid.
Yep,
And again, even for, as we saw during COVID all over the world, who got the brunt of it was mothers and babies,
of
and
course.
that's what we always see. And of course, it just really resonated, like somehow they ended up kind of like having to deal with COVID, even though uh it shouldn't have been like that, you
Yeah.
know.
So true. So in terms of, okay, so we need to support our traditional midwives. We need to
Yeah.
create opportunities for those that would not normally be able to take traditional routes. When I say traditional, they're two type. The what do you is it colonialism? The medical route. Those those that are not able to go to college because their family can't afford it. They're basically barred from the midwifery profession just because they can't
So
go to
hard.
school. So we need to support those that can't go that route. I don't want to call it the
Mhm.
traditional route because we're using the traditional the other way. But then support, yeah. I love Utah, and you say direct entry midwife is is not a word that it's kind of fallen out of favor. I can totally see that, but I also really like it because here in Utah you can direct entry. You can go and apprentice, and you can
Yeah.
you can catch a bazillion babies, and then
Mhm.
call yourself a midwife and go for it. And so I
That's
think it does
awesome.
level the playing field in some ways, but there's still her childcare while she's at birth and supporting her family while she's in her apprenticeship, right? Because usually apprenticeships aren't paid. So,
Yeah. I mean, I always think about like a community, like centering the community. I think it's really important. So like even in Utah, who wherever what like even in your community, your neighborhood, when you think about the kind of midwife that needs to be serving your community, I think that it's real for consumers to know that even if you have a supportive regulatory system in your state, that the United States overall is not supportive of midwifery.
right,
And so
right.
I think that for consumers to know that it really does take consumers to
Oh
change the
my goodness.
laws and to make the regulations
Well, also
better.
just in our own communities. I mean, I know a midwife, she is going to school. She's hardcore right now, and her husband is the stay-at-home dad, and
Cool.
he takes care of the kid, and people kind of judge them. And I'm like, "Okay, come on. We said we wanted more midwives, and now we have a partner stepping up so that his partner can become a midwife, and we're all like thinking he's weird. Come on, guys. Like, where are the childcare rally the circles? Where's the babysitters club,
Yeah.
that take care of so we
I mean,
can.
I think that this is a good point because I don't think anybody can have a conversation about birth without talking about their own internalized things, right? Like
Yeah.
I think that even just starting out a community, starting out with just birth, like if you're a consumer that loves birth, just start out with a birth circle in your own living room and
Mhm.
talk about how everybody birthed and talk about how you were born, because it's really hard to heal birth and to heal your community without healing oneself, so it
It's so true.
really just start there.
Mhm.
And then you'll start to see, consumers really coming out and being like, whoa,
I
understanding, because I think the politics are very complicated in our
Yes.
country for midwives. And so I think it does take some like having to figure
But
that out.
I love your imagery of circling up. It's called birth circle for a reason. Circling up
Yeah.
and talking about your experiences and just also knowing that sometimes you'll never be able to go back generations past because some of our moms and midwife our grandmas are just so sealed. They're so either traumatized or is
Yes.
another
Yeah.
era where we just didn't talk about those things publicly, and that to heal your own birth can sometimes just be a one-sided thing. I know I had the opportunity of talking to my mom about my birth, but not everybody does,
Aw.
right?
Yeah, no, it's such a special thing. And there is a lot of trauma. And also I do think that like baby boomer generation or even the Gen X generation, right? There still wasn't an acceptance of women talking about
Right.
their birth stories. And so I do think that that's really important. I do want to say one thing though, when we talk about licensure, that when I talk about traditional midwives that are not licensed, I talk about midwives that are, I sort of use the Mennonite example or the Amish example of where a community has recognized somebody as the midwife in their community. I want to say that there are midwives that maybe had licensure and then get rid of it, or maybe they have licensure, but they've moved to a state where they're not recognized or where they choose not to license. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that I want consumers to be aware that that's actually very different. There are midwives that are not people of color, that don't have any traditional backgrounds and don't serve a specific community, things like that, who choose not to license. And I would just say tread carefully with that, because I do think that there are some families that want that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a midwife for everybody, and there should be.
There is, right? Yeah, and
Yes,
just find. I know in
but
Utah, those that choose not to license are usually because they want to do homes or twins at home or
uh-huh,
breech, and so it's a
exactly.
choice. But they're sometimes
It
more
is.
experienced than the licensed midwives, and they do actually, I think, in the state a pretty good job of educating their consumers. Like the first time appointment, I've heard lots of midwives explain, I am not licensed and this is what it means and this is why I chose
Yeah.
that. And if you would like something different, then you know
And
go
it's
interview.
multi-layered. Know that your midwife she can go to prison for a long time
Mhm.
doing a birth without being licensed. That's practicing medicine without a license. And so I think as consumers, you also have to recognize all the politics around that
Mhm.
as
Well, it
well. I
depends on
mean,
the state, but yeah,
pretty much almost every state, a midwife can go to prison for pretty
for
easily,
messing things up.
even
Yeah.
if they're licensed, if they do twins or something that's out of their scope. But particularly for a midwife that chooses not to license, I think it's controversial because part of what gets me about that is that there are midwives that choose not to license or were licensed, had a hard time, lost their license, and then decide to stay unlicensed. And I think the reason that bothers me is because there are so many vulnerable people that would love nothing more than to get licensed or to have a licensed provider. And sometimes I feel like those midwives equate themselves and their struggles
Oh,
with
I
people
see what
who
you're
are truly
saying.
vulnerable, or they call themselves traditional midwives and they're not, by our definition as people of color,
That
traditional
is a
midwives.
that is an excellent point. I was coming at from at the angle of there are some people that choose not to license because licensure requires them to act outside what they want to do. Like, for example, going back to the Amish, I don't know a lot about the culture, so I just want to give that disclaimer. But
Yeah.
perhaps licensure in their area would require them to act differently at a birth that would be incompatible with their community practice.
Ah.
So then they choose to stay unlicensed so they can be true to their culture.
But they're traditional because they serve that community. If you're a middle class white woman that is working in Arizona, I'll just use my state, one of my states, and you lost your license or you choose not to license, but you serve whoever comes to you. You're not,
Oh, I
working
see
in
what
a
you're saying.
particular community. I worry when you call yourself a traditional midwife, because traditional midwives they have a very different meaning to
Oh,
people of
okay. I'm
color.
totally gonna adopt what you just said.
Yeah.
It's now become.
But
I love that.
saying that, I think that there are women that want a midwife like that, because of exactly what you said, maybe like in Arizona, twins
But
is not
but what
legal.
you
And
said is I mean, even in this conversation, we're both like the most birthy people in North America, and we still took it different
that's right.
interpretations.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
that is a great that's a great point. You don't want to conflate a traditional midwife with an actual like an indigenous midwife, like
Correct.
indigenous to
Or a
your.
black
Oh,
midwife or
yeah,
a
yeah.
Asian midwife
What's the
that's
word that says
from
like
there.
when you say traditional, we want it's
Uh-huh.
like we're talking about black midwives serving black clients or Native American women midwives serving. What is it? What do you call a midwife that is in your culture and is
A
like
traditional midwife.
I know, but
Yeah.
but then
So
there's
I feel like there are communities that don't have that. And
yeah.
so like if you don't come from one of those communities, you should just call yourself an unlicensed
There you
midwife.
go. Okay. All right. You win. You win the day. No, I love it. I love it because when I hear until talking to you, and now I'm going to correct everyone that I hear, but until talking to you, the word traditional just meant that she used herbs and she was a little bit more
Yes. So
um more of a hippie.
makes okay. That is so awesome, Sarah, because that totally illuminates my whole point,
That's
which
your
is
whole point.
my whole point is that as midwives, we have a lot of there people think a lot of things about us, right? Like
Yeah.
there is so many misconceptions around midwives, but I like to say that when I see a traditional midwife, so a Native American midwife or a Black midwife, is really practicing and using the traditions and the ceremonies of their particular community, I think of that like they're going to be using herbs and medicines and all these things. But that being said, almost all midwives use some form
Yeah, that's true.
of alternative
Yeah.
medicines. I don't, there's not a better word for it, but and so we all kind of do, but there is this thing of like, oh, this midwife is like, she's groovier. She's groovier. She's like, she's going to show up with her bag of like herbs and she's going to do some things. And for our native midwives, it's worse because it's like, oh, she's going to come and drum. Or, for the Black midwives, is what are the Black midwives going to do? What are the Asian midwives going to do?
Hmm.
And so I think that this is how our system has really destroyed midwifery in a way because it has both made us like dirty,
It's
ignorant, like
almost like
all of
it's
that.
taken just the medical part of the midwife and just talked about that instead of all the other stuff. Because you say bring the herbs, bring the drums, bring the songs, bring the tents, bring the whatever it is, and that's been stripped away. Like,
Well, or some people think that that's all it is and that we
oh,
never like they think like that I never went to school but I just like I just bring my bag of herbs and I do your birth. So so it's like this weird, and this is
oh my
how the
gosh, oh my
stigma
gosh.
around midwifery
Okay,
is so
you and me, we're gonna fix
huge.
it. We're gonna fix this. Just kidding.
It's so big, but it's really is based on what happened in the early 1900s when the doctors came in and sort of said like, oh, look at these granny midwives in the South. They're ignorant, they're old, they're dirty, they don't know anything. Oh, look at the Indian problem, like that we like a good Indian is a dead Indian. Like that's what they used to say. And so they took out all of the healers, they took away all of the traditional midwives, they moved women from their tribal communities and they sent them far away to birth, they sent their children far away to be in boarding schools. I mean, the destruction that has happened to the Indigenous and the Black communities in this country, it's so destroyed that when you think about the return of the midwife and what that could mean to a community that they want to birth with their own people, and that really is so healing and so huge, and I think that when all of this confusion that you and I even are talking about is that everybody has their own vision in their mind, but what is that vision based on? It's not really based, it's based on this very European male system of medicine that never ever illuminated the true qualities of the midwife of color that was working in her community.
Oh my lands. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Wow. And even if in groups that feel like they are pretty, well, I'm just speaking from okay, sorry, back up. I will complete a sentence, I promise. But there are a lot of people in my generation that do want to return to their practices. So they'll have circles and it's almost like they're just they don't because their moms aren't present and their grandmas aren't present. And so they're just getting it off TikTok, YouTube
Yeah.
books and trying to
Right.
almost reinvent their communities. And I
Yeah.
think that's beautiful, but it would be just so amazing if a midwife, if we had traditional midwives that could come in and help these young girls figure
Yeah.
it out, like was it reseed? I don't know. It's like I just I
Yeah.
see
I mean,
more of a return to the wanting that traditional cultural practice, but where do you find it
yeah.
that's not culturally appropriating from your own culture? Does that make sense? Like how do you really know when
Well,
it's
I think that's the white person dilemma, is being so also very far away from what I think the white woman um has had a lot of bad things done to her as well, and I
Mhm.
think that
All women?
the white woman dilemma is to reconnect with roots that are not of this country. I mean, you're not native, So the native folks can connect to their country here, right?
Well,
It's
but
their land, it's their territory.
I'm
But
not even
white
talking
folks,
about
I think, can actually reach back into their own cultures, whether
totally.
it's Irish or whether it's old, Scottish or whatever it is, because there's beautiful ceremony to be found in every
Exactly.
country.
But I just know
Yeah.
about 10 years ago when I started getting birthy, I would have a group and we'd have women from all colors in our group, and none of us were raised with any semblance of a tradition. So we were all like borrowing. Like one girl would be like, "Hey, I saw Bindies," and "Hey, I heard about this red tent thing," and "Hey, I heard of a blessing way," and like it would be just like this big mishmash of just trying to figure out what cultural stuff, because none of us, it wasn't a group of white women, it was women that had been pulled out of their culture, that
Yeah.
were raised completely cultureless. So, I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's difficult. So how do we reclaim the, what is the first step to then reclaiming this space for our sisters and our daughters?
Well, I think it's understanding oneself primarily. Like, where are your roots? Who are your roots? And what are the things in your circle or your cycle that need to be
Your
healed? And
cycle, keep talking about your cycle. What do you mean by
yeah.
that? What are the things in your cycle that
Well, I
need?
think that uh, when we think about ancestral trauma, it's a cycle. And I think that
Mm,
for, I was just kind of referencing white women and what's been done to white women as well. And not focusing on white women, but I mean, I'm just saying, like, every person, right, has a cycle of what they have had to go through because our ancestors' genes live in us. And so I think that until there's reckoning with one's cycle of their life and the good things and the bad, that I think that it's hard to even know, right, who you are, like,
I
who am
know.
I think is the first question. And then I think, really deciding, like, well, I don't want to take from somebody else's culture. I want my
Exactly.
own knowing, my own knowings. I think that there is a lot of appropriation that happens all the time in this country. And I think that it's just because people are lost. They don't
They're
really
lost.
understand. Yeah, they don't know, but they don't have to be. And this is something I always say, like, I think that there are cultures that have been able to hold on to their traditions even in the midst of being colonized, like, and I mean just the strength of the Black person and the Native person,
Yeah.
and how they've been able to hold on to so much ceremony within their own traditions, I think is big. But I think that there are also so many people that haven't been able to do that. And so I think that it does take some digging. I think it also, like, I mean, there's some cool things out there. There's so many things where people can just start to, like, do their own reading, form their own groups,
Mhm.
kind of like the groups you're talking about, where you sort of just have like 3 or 4 people come over and be like, hey, I'm really trying to reconnect with this. What do you think? What are your resources? I think too that if you're listening to this and you're a person of color, I think it's really important to know that you do have traditions and they're alive and well in this country. I
Mhm.
think sometimes people aren't aware of that. And especially if you're a person of color that grew up very urban or grew up very far from your traditions, there are pretty much, I can think of midwifery groups for pretty much a lot of different cultures, and that those cultures can all be connected with one way or another. So again, through the use of social media, lots of books. There's so many books written around different types of
Yeah.
traditional birthing customs, things like that. But also sometimes reconnecting with people just from wherever your peoples are from,
Yeah.
depending on where they
Reconnecting.
they immigrated from. Yeah.
So, two questions. One is, what about mixed cultural heritage? How do
Yeah.
you pick which one feels dominant? Can you honor both at the same time? And two is, can you be adopted if you feel estranged from
Mm.
your original heritage? Can you be adopted into another heritage? Does that make sense?
Um, that does make sense. So I think for the first question, I would say, okay, so
Because it seems like
so
it would be easy to return to your roots if you only had one set of roots. If you like, yeah, but most people in
no,
America,
I think that so thinking about how indigenous people have to think about this. This is a big question because our communities have been so destroyed. But I think that it's really about the community that you serve, and the community that you are aligned with and who claims you as theirs. So if you're, half white and half black, I think that within you, you have a community that you identify with more. And this is a question of being multicultural. Like, I think for everybody it will be different. I think if you're half black and half brown, right, like, you'll have a cultural tradition that'll resonate. The cool thing about this day and age is that people are melding all this stuff together, especially these amazing millennials, these young people. And I think that as hopefully as we move forward, the question is put to us to have to choose not by ourselves but by white culture. We've always had to choose what side we want to be on, and it's not anything that our societies have ever done. Is particularly tribal communities have always identified very strongly with their land and with their tribes, but they've never felt that they've had to fully identify the way that white culture has created that. So,
Mm,
for instance, gender, like, being two-spirit or being transgender, things like that. That's something very natural to tribal communities. That's never been anything that they have felt like they've needed to define. But how, the everything around colonialism and
interesting.
Christianity and all that stuff. So I feel like for multicultural folks, there have always been multicultural people, always, forever. um and it was not the people themselves that had to choose what they wanted to be. It was the society that chose. So if you were half black and half white but you looked black, you're going to be black in this culture because that was white society choosing for you.
Mm,
So I think that there's a lot of that. And so I think that that's a question that really isn't about how people choose. It's really a question about our society and how broken it is. The second one about adopting another culture, I think that's tricky, because it
mm-hmm.
feels like that's a question that's not based in equity. It feels like that's uh, because I feel like, again, people shouldn't have to choose. Like, they should be able to, um, you know, there's a really awesome Mohawk elder. Her name is Geji Cook, and she has been a midwife for a long time. And we had this conversation once, and I remember her saying, like, if you aren't born and you don't come from the Longhouse, which is the First Nations way of talking about their communities, if you don't if you don't come from the Longhouse, it's like you can't say that you're from the Longhouse,
Right. Yeah.
and so I think that that is a very traditional way of thinking about your community and where you come from. And so, a lot of people grapple with this. I think Black
Mm-hmm.
Americans grapple a lot because they were taken away from Africa, they were taken away from their peoples. And I think a lot of Latinx folks in this country grapple with it a lot as well because borders crossed us. And Native people grapple with this as well because borders cross them. So again, it isn't our communities that have had to make these choices. They were done to us.
Mm, interesting. But what are you saying about the millennials, the youngs,
Yeah,
finding
I love
going
those
back to
people.
their roots? Yeah, they're really cool, aren't they?
They're so cool. They're so
going
cool.
going back to their roots, but and not feeling like they need to be adopted into a culture, but understanding the cultures of their community, and being I just remember my friend, this is a long time ago, but she learned that bindis like were cultural appropriation. She's like, we're
Yeah.
never ever going to do bindis again. And we're like, oh yeah, you're right. Like it was like an
Yeah.
enlightenment thing. We're like, oh, what else are we appropriating? Oh, what else are we? Oh, interesting. Okay. And then you become like, so it's kind of, I just want to say it's sometimes a messy process to figure out where you came from and who you are.
Yeah.
And
It
sometimes you make mistakes
is.
and you offend people and then you
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think too, like, the other thing I like about the millennials a lot is that they're changing the narrative. I think that's actually the bigger thing. Is that, yeah, they're done with racism and all that other stuff. But I think that what's really cool is that the narrative that younger people are using now when they talk about things, it's not the same. It's like the words are different and the way that people are being talked about, they're not othering people as much, and they're
Yeah, yeah,
not,
yeah. They are. Yeah,
and
it
so
is so
this is,
true.
and also just the economy is different to younger people. Like, so much about racism is power. And I feel like this new group of folks, they have a really different view of power and what it means.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's really a societal change. I think that's a really awesome thing
So really
that's
quick
happening.
though, what back to the I just thought of another question I had. So what if you are like personally adopted into a family, like you marry in, or you've been raised with, or then is that is that okay to say like I know we have a lot. I know several people that have been adopted into the United States into various homes, but they came from like the Ukraine or Romania or
Uh-huh.
China or these other cultures, and but then they're adopted into their family here. So could you be adopted, like if a culture accepts you with open arms, like can you be grafted? Grafting. Can we talk about
So
grafting?
I want to give a lot of grace to a lot of my Asian family and friends out there. And by family, I just mean relatives, people
Yeah.
that I don't even know, but they
Well, we're all
because I
family.
think this is a very big question that right now a lot of folks in the activist community that are adopted, that are Asian and they're adopted, I think this is something that they've been grappling with for a long time. And I just want to give grace to that because I'm not an expert and I don't want to say anything out of respect to that work that they're doing. So I guess I'm just going to say I don't know because
Mm.
I don't know. And I'm not somebody that has done a lot of work in that area. And I think that I would defer to just these incredible activists in the Asian community that are working around these subjects because I think this is a really, really important subject. I also think that there is a whole thing around adoption in our country that has a crazy history. There's a, we talked a little bit about natives having to go to boarding school, but there's also a lot of there's there's this whole there's this thing called orphan abduction that happened in
Yeah.
the Southwest, which I think really goes to talk about how children were also abducted because their families were vulnerable. Like there's so many facets to this. It's a very
Well,
it's a
I've got the rest
tenuous
of the day. I go to
conversation.
bed. We could go on
Yeah.
for 9 hours.
It's a tenuous
But,
conversation. So I'm just going to say that I don't feel
you know,
qualified to answer
yeah,
that.
that makes a lot of sense. But what I do feel from you is that you are very optimistic that in several generations in the future that we'll be treating this completely differently.
I think that I'm hoping like not even in several generations. I'm hoping in by the next generation.
Yeah,
So we'll see. I mean, of course it's going to all take a lot of time, but I'm hoping to see some good change just in my lifetime.
I agree with. I've already seen change in my life, and just in the 10 years I've been in the birthing community, just a lot of change. But I'm excited for what our daughters and our granddaughters and okay, so one more question. What in what ways have you seen women heal through their connection with
Hmm.
their foremothers and their cultural birth practices? And then I will let you move on with your day, but you've been just too fun to talk to.
Oh, wow. So, the thing about birth that's so cool is that birth gives us all an opportunity to um it's almost like birth opens up this portal of where we have choices. And so one of those choices I see a lot of women and birthing people make is that they recognize that they want to heal from things. Because when people get pregnant, I feel like their whole life comes back to them.
Yep.
Like you're
Flashes
pregnant and
before
like
their
everything you've ever been through comes back to you.
Yep.
And so I think that when someone gets pregnant, they have this opportunity to like think about how are they eating? How are they managing stress? What is the trauma that's coming back that there maybe is bringing fear? Or what are the things they have to work out with their partner or with their family or even with their parents, their moms and their dads and all this other stuff. And so I think that I see some people really consciously making a decision to do something different, do something better, or heal themselves from things because they have this child coming into the world and they want this child to experience life in a different way. And so I think that a lot of people have an opportunity to make such incredible decisions. And this is why I think it's really important people do their interviews and do all their research and everything, so that they're really choosing carefully for themselves what they want. And so what I have seen is I've seen people make a lot of really dramatic changes, and they're not always easy. They can be really
No.
hard. And then I've seen people be real careful about their birthing decisions so that they have the birth that they want in the place that they want, in the place that they feel safe, whether that's hospital, home, or birth center. And they have the people that make them feel valued and loved, and they ensure that their birth is a birth of love, no matter how it happens. And I think that somebody comes away from that a lot stronger. And I think then it's like sets up this platform for somebody to go like, wow, I did that myself. I self-directed my own. I was autonomous in my own birthing process, because again, birth is not an illness. It's actually a part of our journey of life. And I think that if people have that attitude towards it, then it's really a different thing than if it's like, oh my God, I'm sick and somebody has to save me and take this baby out of my, womb and all this other stuff. And so I just think there's different ways of approaching birth. And some of those ways have the ability to be pretty miraculous when it comes to healing.
It's not like just changing your diet, but it's also like going back to your heritage and having the opportunity to use those tools to. Cool. Okay.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Seriously, I could talk to you all day. Tell everybody where they can find more about you and connect with you, all the
Aw.
things you do.
Yes, I definitely want to say if you're a person of color, you have an interest in accessing or becoming a midwife, just definitely find us through changingwomaninitiative.com. All the information is there. And I would say if you are a consumer and you just are interested in just midwifery in general, just know that on social media, as well as your own regulatory state, you can find so much information about the midwives in your own state and the associations and things like that. So I just say get involved, learn about your midwives, learn what they do, support us so that there can be more of us filling the gaps.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. I don't know if that was the turn that you were
That was
hoping
great.
for.
No, I was just excited to talk to you. I don't have any judgment, but it was really, really cool. There's a lot of things that you said that really make a lot of sense and kind of clarify my own positions that I didn't have words for before. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I appreciate it.
Please visit us at birthcircle.com, join our Facebook groups, or find us on Instagram and Pinterest. We hope you'll use our resources to support your birthing experience.